Great. Thank you so much for the information that you shared, Dr. Dorsey. So obviously a little nerve-wracking trying to stay healthy in this world when even the air we breathe is dangerous, and even places where we think are safe, like where we grew up, may be, right near an area that is so toxic. So now we're going to begin the Q&A portion. Just real quickly, if you want to check out Dr. Dorsey's books, you can go to our website and you can find what books he has available. And then you can, go to Amazon, or do you sell these on your website as well, Dr.
No,
Dorsey?
just through Amazon. They're also in libraries. And again, if you can't afford a copy, they're also in other bookstores. If you can't afford a copy, just email us info@endingpd.org and we'll send you one for free.
All right, great. For anyone in the audience that would like to ask any questions, you can raise your hand in Zoom. The instructions on how to do so are in chat. Note that we don't take any questions directly from chat, so please raise your hand in Zoom if you'd like to ask a question. So I know you do work with, or have done work with, MichaelJFox and his organization. Can you describe what kind of work that he does? Does he talk about the chemical causes of it, or is he just talking about his own experience? What's happening with that kind of work?
MichaelJFox had an interview with Jane Pauley recently, in which she asked him how he thought he got Parkinson's disease. My understanding is he's pursued genetic testing, and is that like 85% of Americans that don't have an identifiable genetic risk factor. And he said in the interview with Jane Pauley that he got exposure. He thinks he got Parkinson's from exposure to some kind of toxin. And if, what a great legacy for us. MichaelJFox has been the face of Parkinson's disease now for 30 years. I mean, his suffering is that of biblical proportions. He can't even walk down the streets of New York without falling over. Shouldn't we take it upon ourselves to support people like MichaelJFox, find out what these toxins are that are causing MichaelJFox to suffer as much as he has, and to make sure that we minimize or eliminate these toxins so that future generations do not have to suffer like MichaelJFox has? I mean, I think there are things that we can do and things that, quite frankly, we have the responsibility to do to change the course of these diseases.
And are these toxins that cause the disease, according to your research, are they still in the body? Can they be tested for to see how much we have? Could we look at MichaelJFox and say, okay, you have Parkinson's. Let's look at all the toxins in your body. Oh, you've got a disproportionate amount of this, and do this over a population of people with Parkinson's over the general public.
So there are a few things that you can see. So we know that in the brains of people with Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease, there's high levels of heavy metals in people's brains. So the natural consequence, some people might ask, well, what about taking those metals out? So there was actually a study looking at chelation therapy, removing iron from brains of individuals with Parkinson's disease. The drug got to keep the iron out, but people's Parkinson's disease got worse, much worse, and their health was exacerbated by the chemicals. So in some cases, it's really hard, and you can even get these chemicals out, but it might have adverse health consequences. Certain things that dissolve in your fat are really hard to get rid of. So I mentioned that certain pesticides can be dissolved in the fat and be stayed in the fat. And so we saw in that study in the Netherlands that levels of pesticides, A, are found in people's fat, and B, can decrease over time. It's also worth noting that the only time we really excrete some of these things is, for example, when women nurse. So you can find pesticides in the breast milk of nursing women. And obviously those pesticides are then passed on to their children when they nurse. And those children have growing, developing, less protected brains, and might be exquisitely sensitive to the effects of these pesticides in them. Other chemicals like trichloroethylene, if you have ongoing exposure, you can find them in the blood or in the urine. So a study in Italy found trichloroethylene, this chemical, in the urine of 3/4 of men in Italy, I believe in the 1990s. The challenge is once you stop the exposure, if you've had exposure to this, like the Marines 30 years ago, as far as I know, you can't detect it in the body years after the effect.
So what is the determining factor as to why some people might get Parkinson's disease and why others might not, given if two people or a group of people grow up in the same area, have the same level of exposure, I assume that it's, it's not, they're not, if one person gets it, doesn't mean they're all going to get it. What might be the difference between why one person might get Parkinson's and another doesn't? And does that open it up to being a genetic predisposition should one be exposed to these chemicals?
So genetics plays a role, but a small role. So let's think about two brothers or two siblings who smoke. If one gets lung cancer, does that mean the other one's automatically going to get lung cancer? No. In fact, only 10% of smokers get lung cancer. Does smoking cause lung cancer? Absolutely. If you don't smoke, your likelihood of getting lung cancer is really, really, really remote. And if you don't get exposure to chemicals like radon, air pollution, and asbestos, it's even really, 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 really small. So there have to be other factors that determine when people are exposed to a toxin, whether that's smoking cigarettes or paraquat, what determines whether someone develops the disease or not. I'll give you three main factors. The first is exposure, and probably the most important. We have to, what was the dose of exposure? What was the duration of exposure? And when were you exposed? I think for many of these brain diseases that exposure in early childhood, even in utero, is especially important because we know it takes years, if not decades, for these diseases to unfold, and therefore, earlier exposure is more likely to become manifest than later exposure, and it's quite possible that young children, for example, are more sensitive to the effects. So one is exposure. The second is interactions. So interactions with genetic factors, as you mentioned. So about 15% of people carry a genetic risk factor for Parkinson's disease. For the vast majority of that 15%, for 90+% of that 15%, those genetic risk factors are insufficient to cause the disease. Only about 1 out of every 100 people with Parkinson's disease have the disease from a purely genetic cause. But those genetic risk factors have interactions with some of these toxicants. So for example, a common mutation called LARC2 affects about 2 to 3% of people with Parkinson's disease, has synergistic effects in animal models when exposed to pesticides. So there could be genetic interactions. There's also probably differences in the way individuals metabolize these pesticides that might lead some individuals to be more susceptible to their toxic effects and others less susceptible. But in addition to genetic interactions, there are likely environmental interactions. So someone could be exposed to pesticides and dry cleaning chemicals. Someone could be exposed to pesticide A and pesticide B. And some people could be exposed to pesticides and head trauma, for example, which we know amplifies the risk of Parkinson's disease. And then likely in the interactions is chance. Dr. Borkhammer points out that chance likely plays a role in who develops cancer and likely in who develops Parkinson's disease. And the third are factors that modify the disease itself or the pathological process, age being probably the biggest one. As we get older, our ability to handle these misfolded proteins decreases. Other things like other diseases, intercurrent illnesses, stress, all might modify the disease progress. So one is the level of exposure itself and timing of it. Second is our interactions with genetic, environmental, and chance factors. And the third are modifiers.
And when, given someone's exposed to it at a relatively young age, we don't see children often, I assume, with Parkinson's disease. It's something that I've personally heard of. When does it tend to express itself? And are there particular triggers that cause it to express itself at any given time?
We also have a listener with a question. So the rates of Parkinson's disease triple every decade, beginning in the 40s. So the incidence number of new cases triples every decade, beginning in the 40s. There's one other disease that has that exact same pattern, and that's lung cancer. Lung cancer and Parkinson's disease essentially are almost non-existent before age of 40. If we all died from a car accident or whatever it is at age 40, almost none of us would ever develop Parkinson's disease or lung cancer. It doesn't mean that these factors, that smoking or that some of these pesticides don't cause or contribute to the disease. It just means it takes years of likely exposure and years or decades for these diseases to unfold or manifest themselves. As I alluded to, in some cases, Parkinson's disease might begin in the nose, some cases in the gut, and by the time it gets all the way back to the parts of the brain that are responsible for movement and tremor, it takes years or decades for that actually to take place. So you need to live a relatively long life for the diseases to become manifest.
And given that this is environmental and, where you want to go play soccer, you don't realize this stuff is out in the field and you want to I don't know, do something crazy like breathe oxygen, you're exposed. I know it's radical thinking. How do we protect ourselves from from or at least how do we decrease the likelihood that we're going to get Parkinson's? This is one of those diseases that I think really scare people because you can live a while and yet your life really shrinks to a really challenging experience. So what would you suggest is the best ways to protect ourselves?
Yes, I mean, who wants to spend the last 20 years of their life losing their independence with Parkinson's, and who, quite frankly, wants to spend 20 years of their life caring for someone with Parkinson's disease? So I'll tell you what they do in China. They're so concerned about air pollution in China that for some of the schools, they build domes around the school and the soccer field so the kids can go outside and play soccer without breathing in the toxic air. Now, obviously, that's not a very practical solution, but there are some practical solutions. Some states have banned the use of pesticides on playing fields at schools. You know, kids can play soccer with fields that have weeds. That can be done. If you belong to a golf course, you can ask your golf course, you know, what are you spraying on the golf course and for what purpose? Can we get by with less pesticides? Can we get by with less toxic pesticides? Are there alternatives to doing so? There are studies that link green space workers, you know, landscapers, for example, to both to ALS and to Parkinson's disease. So I'll tell you very practically what I do in my life since we're writing this book is I buy organic. I'm a physician, so I have the means to do so, but it's a lot cheaper to buy organic than it is to have Parkinson's disease. I wash all my fruits and vegetables, even the organic ones, which still have residues of pesticides on them, and with water and soap. I use a vegetable wash from Trader Joe's. So I have a glass bowl. I put all my fruit in a bowl and I wash them with soap and water. And then before I eat them, I put a carbon filter, like something from Pure or Brita, on my faucet at home. If I got my water from a well, which 40 million Americans do, up to 40 million Americans do, I'd have that well tested for pesticides and these chemicals like trichloroethylene, especially if I lived in suburban or urban environments. Wells are not regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act, so don't have the same protections that municipal or city water has in place. I like to bike, and so I wear a helmet anytime I bike. If I skied, I'd wear a helmet because head trauma is associated with ALS, it's associated with dementia, and it's associated with Parkinson's disease. I avoid dry cleaning. I launder all my shirts, and when I do, the rare times I do get anything dry cleaned, I use a dry cleaner that doesn't use chemicals like trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene, which are associated with Parkinson's disease. If I lived in a heavily polluted area, I would have an air purifier in my home. I would put one in my kitchen and in my bedroom. If I were driving through heavy traffic, I would roll up my windows, turn on my air condition, and recirculate the air. So I think there are lots of things that we can do in an individual life. We're writing a second book, a sequel to it, in which we're going to have the Parkinson's 25 things that ordinary individuals can do to lower their risk of Parkinson's disease, and likely, I think, perhaps slow the rate of progression for people who already have the disease. That needs to be demonstrated. But I think there are lots of things we can do in an individual life to lower our risk of developing these brain diseases. But fundamentally, you know, short of building domes over neighborhoods or over schools, these are societal decisions, and we need to hold our representatives accountable for creating a clean environment where we have an expectation of clean water, clean food, and clean air, and that expectation is met with reality.
Thank you. So during the pandemic, there was research that suggests that people who that lived a whole food plant-based lifestyle and generally took care of themselves through that modality had a significantly lower risk, like over 70% lower risk of getting the infection. Is there anything like that where being generally healthy matters? Do we know that that people who are less that eat the standard American diet, for example, are more susceptible to getting Parkinson's disease, or does that even matter?
Yeah, so a Mediterranean diet has been associated with a modestly decreased risk of developing Parkinson's and may have a modestly decreased rate of progression. I think the biggest factor is what you're not eating. So Mediterranean diet's high in fruits and vegetables, low in animal products. And what do animals do? They concentrate these toxins as they move up the food chain. I'll give you an example. A pesticide that had been banned in the United States called heptachlor was used in Hawaii because the Pineapple Growers Association of Hawaii wanted an exemption to use heptachlor on its pineapple crop. And they used it on their pineapple crop, and then the top of the pineapple, the green thing, is called the chop. And then they fed that chop to cows, but they fed it soon after they had harvested the pineapples, and that chop still had heptachlor in it. And what did the cows do? Well, they concentrated that fat-soluble pesticide in their milk. And then where'd that milk go? Well, it went onto the stores in Hawaii, and then they had a recall of that milk. It turned out at the same time this is all happening, researchers just by coincidence are doing a study of aging, and they find out that high milk consumers in Hawaii had higher rates of Parkinson's disease. They looked in the brains of these individuals. They found fewer dopamine-producing nerve cells in their brain, and they found the residue of the pesticide in the brain of these individuals. So I get really concerned when I like cheese. When I eat cheese, what's in my cheese? I don't want pesticides in my cheese. I don't want the pesticide in the cheese entering in my gut and then causing misfolding of proteins that might affect what's in my brain years or decades later. So I think we need to pay a lot of attention to what we eat. The same thing has been happened for other chemicals, including PCBs. So yeah, I think we should be very concerned about adopting a healthy lifestyle for a whole range of reasons, including brain health.
Okay, so bioaccumulation through animals is a major concern. All right, great. And I think maybe you should watch some of our other speakers on dairy in general. There's some great speakers.
I know they're not going to say good things, but
right. So so our next question is coming from Joe W. Please state where you're from and ask your question.
Hello, Doctor. Joe W. from California. Reading online, lead and mercury are associated with tremors. Lead in water is associated with Parkinson's. Mercury is in millions and millions of fillings people have. Question, here's about your comment about that. Also comment, medical establishment is slow to call for the elimination of these things, slow to recognize that they're even dangerous. And other question, amyloid plaque may be caused by ultra-processed, high animal and processed foods. What do you think about that in terms of brain disease?
So I'm going to punt on the amyloid plaque. There'll be probably some Alzheimer's experts who can give you a better answer, but I'll address the heavy metals and the medicine's response. So I think I have a slide on heavy metals that I didn't really touch on. Do I have the heavy metals? Oh, I didn't touch on it. So heavy metals likely play a role in Parkinson's disease. Lead is probably on it. Manganese, another metal that's associated with welding, has been associated with Parkinson's or Parkinson's-like disease. And we mentioned that these heavy metals are found in higher concentration in individuals with Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease. So there are lots of good reasons to limit your exposure to environmental high levels of metals. In medicine, we're too often taught to go from disease to treatment, especially American medicine. If someone's got appendicitis, you take the appendix out. Someone's short of breath, you give them oxygen. Someone's got Parkinson's, you give them medication that replaces the dopamine that's lost. We need to think about going from disease to cause. So when someone has Parkinson's disease, my first question in my mind now is why do they have Parkinson's disease? And I'll give you 3 reasons why that's really important. One, I can't think of any condition that we cure medically where we don't know its cause. So one, there's relatively few conditions that we cure, but if we don't know what its cause is, it's really hard to cure it. I'll give you an example. In the 1980s, bleeding ulcers were a huge cause of death and morbidity in the United States and around the world. I don't know if people remember what ulcers were thought to be due to. Michael, do you remember what they thought ulcers were due to?
I think they said that it was stress, basically,
yes.
that would cause it.
Stress. And so they said you need to change your work, you need to stop working as many hours. It was nonsense, a complete and utter nonsense. If doctors were giving completely the wrong advice, ulcers were due to, Michael, do you recall what ulcers are due to?
A. pylori?
Yeah, a bacteria. So ulcers are due to a bacteria. What was the cure for it? An antibiotics and a cocktail of drugs, and you're cured of ulcers. Almost no one dies of bleeding ulcers in the United States anymore because we found out what its cause is. So if we find out what the cause is of a disease, including like things like hepatitis C, which used to be called non-hepatitis A, non-hepatitis B, then we found it's a virus, and now you take a pill and you're cured of hepatitis C. Remarkable advances. But if we don't know what's causing a disease, it's really, really, really hard to cure it. Second, is if you know what's causing a disease, you can reduce your exposure to it. So if you're smoking and you get diagnosed with lung cancer, what's the first thing the doctor's going to tell you to do? Stop smoking. But if you get Parkinson's disease or you get Alzheimer's disease, does the doctor ever tell you to stop getting exposed to air pollution? Do they say to stop getting exposed to pesticides? Do they say stop dry cleaning your clothes with chemicals that are linked to it? I've never heard anyone say that, except maybe me on occasion. Even I only do it on occasion. And then third, and perhaps most powerfully, if you find out what the cause of a disease is you can prevent people from getting it. The response to any crisis, the response to any pandemic is the first thing is to contain it. If you have a fire, you close the doors and you stop fueling it with oxygen. If you have a pandemic, you quarantine people who are infected so other people who aren't affected stay unaffected. We have not done that for Parkinson's disease. We've only added fuel to the fire. We're spraying paraquat today on fields throughout the United States. In California, perhaps near where you live, Joe, our people are spraying paraquat in the fields in Central California. And along with spraying paraquat, I think they're spraying the seeds of future cases of Parkinson's disease. We need to stop fueling the fire so we can reduce the number of people affected by Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, autism, ALS, and many other brain diseases.
Great, thank you. And how is Parkinson's disease diagnosed? Is it symptomatology? Are there specific tests that can be done to say, oh, yep, you have Parkinson's disease?
By and large, it's based on symptoms, and you have two of the following four symptoms. Tremor, usually in the hands, usually asymmetric, worse on one side than the other. Second, slowness of movement. Third is stiffness. And fourth is difficulty with walking or balance. If you have two of those four, you have Parkinsonism. And the most common cause of it, there's some medications that can cause those symptoms, but the most common cause is Parkinson's disease, I think, due to these environmental toxins. Now, there's some research. We've had a fancy imaging test that can help tell whether someone has a Parkinsonian disorder, so that's available. Really recent research suggesting that you can find this misfolded protein in the skin of individuals. I kind of glossed over it, but if you have some astute viewers, which I know you do, we're not sure what role skin exposure to these toxins, including, pesticides, for example, including dry cleaning chemicals, that people who might work with it, what role they might play in Parkinson's disease. I get really concerned about what role skin exposure, for example, to pesticides might be playing in ALS. For example, studies in Italy, Scotland, and Spain have all linked soccer playing to different brain diseases, including ALS. And so as some people know that the nerve cells that innervate the muscle that's right underneath the skin is affected in ALS. So I get really concerned about what skin exposure might be. But it turns out skin might be a skin test might be a powerful way of diagnosing Parkinson's disease.
And when we see someone with Parkinson's disease, obviously they have a hard time moving around. What is the cognitive impact? Does it impair any sort of intellectual or cognitive functions?
So by and large, for most people with Parkinson's disease, especially if it begins in the nose, if it's through inhaled, significant cognitive impairment is a later manifestation of disease. But after 5, 10, 15 years, people do get cognitive impairment. If the disease is beginning in the gut, many people get something called dementia with Lewy bodies. Robin Williams, for example, had this dementia with Lewy bodies. And there you're getting it spreading usually along nerve pathways on both sides of the body, because the gut receives innervation from the right side and the left side of the spinal cord and the brain. And so it's likely spreading up both hemispheres. And when you spread up into both hemispheres, you're more likely to get dementia. And so people who are getting exposure through toxins that they're ingesting may be more prone to dementia with Lewy bodies and have more significant cognitive impairment than those who don't.
Great. Next question is coming from Stephen V. Please state where you're from and ask your question.
Buffalo, New York. What do you think about, we had the fires last year in Canada. We had a lot of particulate matter. What do you think about that as a problem? And what do you think about, the home air purifiers as a mitigating strategy?
Well, I thought a lot about it because I like to bike and I like to be outside. And, what's a great way to be healthy is to spend a lot of time outside. So I was wearing my N95 mask last summer, not because of COVID, but because when I was biking to work, I didn't want to be breathing in the toxic air that we breathe in Rochester and Buffalo and in New York City and many other cities throughout North America. My parents live in Southern California. So 2 years ago, our children bought their grandparents air purifiers for their home. So I think these air purifiers can reduce exposure to particulate matter. And if I lived in a part of the country that had high levels of air pollution, or part of the world that had high levels of air pollution, which is really concerning, I would think about an air purifier.
Great. Thank you. And what are early signs of Parkinson's disease that should concern someone enough that they should go get themselves checked? And does catching Parkinson's disease early have an impact on mitigating the presentation and the further worsening of the disease?
So we really haven't studied that second question really well, but early symptoms of disease, as I alluded to, some Parkinson's begins in the gut. So one of the earliest features of the disease is constipation, which can precede the development of tremor by years, if not decades. So obviously I don't want anyone who's got constipated to think that Parkinson's disease is the reason. That's not the top 1, 2, or 3 reasons, but that can be an early feature of the disease. Disturbances in sleep, something called REM sleep behavior disorder. So normally when we're dreaming during REM sleep, we're getting chased by the lion, for example, we're paralyzed during that time. People who have REM sleep behavior disorder, which is very common as a prodromal feature of Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease, tend to act out those dreams. So they might strike their bed partner. So if your bed partner is acting out their dreams consistently, that's another early concerning feature of Parkinson's or other neurodegenerative diseases. Turns out loss of smell. Parkinson's disease begins in many cases with pathology in the smell centers of our brain. Alzheimer's disease, likewise. I think air pollution is playing a big role in both those diseases. So loss of smell, again, often precedes the tremor and slowness of movement and the memory disturbance by years, if not decades. So early loss of smell, not from COVID, but from other factors, would be concerning.
And what is the current treatment for Parkinson's disease, and what are the limitations of the treatments?
So I think the number one thing is to stop exposure to these toxins. So if I had these symptoms, if I had a loss of smell, if I had a history of exposure to well water, if I had a history of exposure working with this chemical trichloroethylene, I would be really, really vigilant about my exposure to these chemicals. So I told you about organic. Our yard, that we don't use pesticides in our yard. We have lots of dandelions. I'd much rather have dandelions than Parkinson's disease. So I would be really, really vigilant about exposure to toxicants in my environment.
And but are there medications that we can take?
Oh yeah, medications. Yeah. So second thing I would do is exercise. So exercise is really beneficial for people with Parkinson's disease. And it turns out that vigorous exercise, the equivalent to 3.5 to 4 hours of exercise in your 40s, 50s, can decrease your risk of associated with a 20% decreased risk of ever developing the disease. So these are all those modifiers I was talking about. So I think modifying it with exercise and diet. And then the most effective medication for Parkinson's disease is a medication called levodopa, which is really effective. It's a miracle drug when it was created in the 1960s and 70s, and alleviates many of the symptoms with Parkinson's disease. And then for some individuals, there are surgical treatments, including something called deep brain stimulation, which in the right individuals can be of great benefit.
And you said 3.5 to 4 hours. Is that per week?
Per week, yes. And so that's the equivalent of like running or swimming.
Okay, great. And are there any new treatments on the horizon that give not the medical industry, who has a motive of raking in money, but give you hope for the future of patients with Parkinson's disease?
Just like on the medication front, just like an insulin pump has made people's lives with diabetes much better, there are likely to be levodopa pumps that are coming that pump the medication into your skin. In full disclosure, I've done some consulting for a company that's developing it. There are some therapies that are targeting the underlying genetic mutations that are contribute to Parkinson's disease. Unfortunately, only a small number of people have these genetic mutations, but it turns out that trichloroethylene and this mutation LARC2 both increase the activity of this protein called LARC2. And so it may turn out that environmental toxicants are acting through similar mechanisms that genetic mutations lead to Parkinson's disease. So that environmental and genetic causes may be acting through common pathways, in which case drugs that are targeting these common pathways could be a benefit not only for people with genetic cause of the disease, but people with environmental causes as well. I think those are two areas that are promising. I'll just point out, we're spending a lot of time and energy trying to cure a preventable disease. Out of every Parkinson's research dollar, only 2 cents goes to preventing the disease. Out of every Parkinson's research dollar, only 2 cents goes to preventing what is likely a preventable disease. If we don't change our actions there, we're going to be chasing our tails. Just like if you were running an auto shop and everyone coming in with flat tires, it's important to change those flat tires. But at some point in time, someone needs to say, what's wrong with the roads? And we need, with Parkinson's, to devote a lot more time and energy to figuring out what's wrong with our roads, or in this case, what's wrong with the environment, so we can prevent people from ever developing this debilitating and deadly disease.
And is there any hope that it can be reversed? Has there been any examples of people who were presenting with obviously, I guess, classic characteristics of Parkinson's disease and then reverse that disease? Are those
Not
symptoms?
to my knowledge, but I'll tell you, there have been case reports. So these are single cases, so lots of grains of salt, that showed a woman was working with pesticides and was starting to develop weakness in her hands. I think it was in her hands. And when she stopped the occupational exposure to the pesticides, the weakness in her hands went away. And, make you think, could ALS in the very, very earliest stages of the disease, could these things be reversible? And so if you think about it, you would think at some point in time, things go from progressive to, a period of time where you could intervene. Some of my colleagues are spending a lot of their time trying to identify people at high risk for developing Parkinson's, through sophisticated imaging or other testing, and then to introduce, and many of them introduce, either exercise or medications to prevent people from at high risk from ever developing the disease. But I think, we really need to take an approach that Real Truth About Health, is about preventing the disease in the first place. I don't want to be cured of prostate cancer. I don't want impotence. I don't want incontinence. I just never want to get prostate cancer. And if we take it away, if we look at many of these brain diseases as preventable, which I think they are, we can live in a world that's largely free of them and all live longer, healthier, and more productive and more independent lives.
So point taken on prevention over cure, but I do have some questions that I'm going to be asking on once someone has it. And I mentioned, I asked you about diet as a preventative measure, but has diet shown any promise for slowing the progress, mitigating the expression of the disease?
Yeah, so some studies have suggested the Mediterranean diet may be beneficial for individuals who already have the disease. One of the problems with Parkinson's disease is that we're really terrible at measuring disease progression. And we do that by having people tap their thumb and index finger really fast and having someone like me rate that on a scale that goes from 0 to 4 with a subjective measure that's categorical and insensitive to change. So our ability to assess and determine whether certain interventions, whether it's diet, exercise, or other changes in our lifestyle, are beneficial is limited because of our insensitivity of these measures. But that said, there's really good evidence that exercise is beneficial for people with Parkinson's disease. There's modest evidence for that exercise is beneficial for individuals. I mean, that a Mediterranean diet is beneficial. I think intellectually that there's powerful evidence that limiting your exposure to these toxicants would be helpful. There have been studies that have linked high levels of air pollution to an increased risk of hospitalization among individuals with Parkinson's disease. So I think if I had Parkinson's disease, I'd give a lot of thought to where I live if I had the means to do so, which is a small portion of the population. But I think there are things that we can do to limit our exposure to these. If I had a Parkinson's disease and I didn't want to get Alzheimer's disease or I didn't want to get cognitive impairment, I would be especially interested in breathing in clean air and might make determinations where I live around that.
I have a feeling that you caused half of the audience to be going like this. I know that I was doing that
I
myself.
thought you were going to say that half the audience was going to be paying attention to the air that they're breathing, but
I think to the extent that we have control, this is the audience that will go the extra mile to prevent themselves from getting sick. This is definitely a proactive audience. So this is definitely, I think, your crowd.
And I think that, and that, I think this audience might get ridiculed or, I don't know, looked down upon it at sometimes. But, it is the people who are at the leading edge who change the course of society. Now, sometimes people are wrong who are at the leading edge and they get it wrong. But it's people like who are radical, who are a little bit more motivated, who like look at the world a little bit differently, who don't buy into the biomedical healthcare industry complex